Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak to the Fair Trade Australian Standards Bill 2013 as it has been proposed by our colleague Senator Madigan, and I do wish to put on record that I do not support the bill as it has been presented by Senator Madigan, but at the same time, Acting Deputy President, I do want to express my support for the sentiment that has been expressed by Senator Madigan and, of course, his deep interest in protecting Australian industry, protecting Australian jobs and Australia's place in the world. The situation clearly, Acting Deputy President, is that the bill, as it's been presented to the Senate, will do nothing to advance the interests of Australia or Australian consumers or indeed the Australian economy, but it would leave our exporters vulnerable to retaliatory action by other countries. It is important, Acting Deputy President, that we are all very clear on the circumstance of Australia, its economy, its place in the world, and indeed why Australia enjoys such a high per capita income, why we are regarded as such a wealthy country. We are, of course, only 23 million people in the same landmass as the United States of America, which has some 350 million people, and we have the same population, indeed, as Greater New York. And when you have a look at China with 1.2 billion people, you look at India, which is rushing towards 1.2 billion people, indeed India, the landmass of Western Australia, only 1/3 of our continent. It's interesting to reflect why is it that we actually do enjoy such a high per capita income. There are a number of reasons. One, of course, has been and hopefully will continue to be cheap energy, but the other point that has got to be made very strongly relevant to this debate, of course, is the fact that we are an exporting country. We cannot consume anywhere near what we actually produce. My own home state of Western Australia is an example when it comes to grain, particularly wheat production. Acting Deputy President, we export about 95% of everything that we produce. The point, of course, is that Australia must observe its obligations under World Trade Organisation agreements, its commitments and, of course, its commitments to free trade. We must be able to regulate goods that are sold in Australia and to prevent the import of goods that do not meet our mandatory standards. Now, of course, it is necessary for people to understand that there are elements within Senator Madigan's bill, the Fair Trade Australian Standards Bill, that will actually adversely impact on our capacity, on our reputation and indeed impact on our compliance with world trade and other agreements. And I want to go through some of those. The point that I want to leave the chamber with, Acting Deputy President, is that Australia is a major beneficiary of World Trade Organisation agreements, our commitments and indeed the other trading agreements with which we are signatories. Now, there are times, I've got to say to you, where these are frustrating. I think back to the debate we had over the importation of apples from New Zealand, Acting Deputy President. An enormous amount of argument went on, and I led the arguments, I must say, with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food when the sequence, of course, was then Prime Minister Gillard in New Zealand, in Wellington, saying we're going to allow the import of your apples into Australia, and all of a sudden the very daft officials who had argued so eloquently against apples coming in from New Zealand to Australia had to sort of change horse in mid-stream or stream in mid-horse, whichever you want to take on board. And then they had to argue to our Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee why, indeed, all the very reasons that they'd previously given for why apples should not be able to be imported from New Zealand to Australia now can be. Now, I am one who argued vehemently, but the point I need to make is that it went to the independent international arbiter, the umpire, the World Trade Organisation. We put our case, the New Zealanders put their case, and it came down in favour of New Zealand. To this day, I still argue about the risk matrix that was adopted. But nevertheless, we are in a global trading environment. We must accept the rules of the umpire if we want to play on the oval. And that's exactly where we are. We can't pick and choose. We can't have a set of circumstances in which we place greater burdens on importers of our products coming into this country, indeed, than we ourselves would expect to be placed upon us. And once again, Acting Deputy President, by way of illustration, I think in practical terms of the move made in 2009 when the then Prime Minister Rudd and the then Trade Minister Crean put pressure on the then Agriculture Minister, Mr Burke, to actually cursorily allow the importation of beef from the United States and Canada, and Japan was also an applicant in that process, without going through an import risk analysis process. And it was largely Senator Heffernan, supported at that time by Senator Nash and myself, that led a very spirited campaign, Acting Deputy President, over an extended period of time in which we were able to prove to Minister Burke that he should indeed require a full import risk analysis. And I just want to, for a couple of moments, because it's absolutely relevant to this legislation, I want to share with the chamber what some of the background was. One of the precepts, one of the absolute rock-hard conditions associated with World Trade Agreements is that you cannot impose on another country that which you do not impose on your own producers. So we had a circumstance, Japan, Canada and the United States of America were all wanting lifting of sanctions against the importation of beef, and of course principally because those countries, especially Canada and the United States, had BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as mad cow disease, a disease which we know had been transmissible to human beings, and of course we all know about the BSE outbreak in the United Kingdom in the middle part of the last decade. What was interesting in that whole process, Acting Deputy President, by way of allowing it to flow out, the Japanese unfortunately got foot-and-mouth disease, so they ceased to be an applicant under this process. And when it came to the United States of America and the claim that we were imposing those sanctions, if you like, or those hurdles or barriers on the United States which we ourselves did not impose, it came down to a national livestock identification system. And we in this country do have an NLIS for our cattle herds. A consumer purchasing a retail product today, should anything adverse occur, we can actually go right back through the supply chain from that product in the retail store, back through the wholesaler, back to the processing facility at which it was processed, and then through to the original property. And so we were able to prove to the Americans that since they did not have a national livestock identification scheme, that indeed we were not imposing on the Americans anything greater than we imposed on our own producers. And you, now Acting Deputy President in the chair, of course you were part of that committee process. And basically what it was World Trade Organisation agreements playing out in the correct space. So therefore America itself was unable to continue that line of argument. And to finish off the trifecta, you'll remember, Acting Deputy President, that right in the midst of it all, a 7-year-old Angus cow from Manitoba in Canada was diagnosed with BSE. And so, of course, the end result of that was that Mr Burke, the then Agriculture Minister, did require an import risk analysis process to be undertaken. I make that point to the chamber because it shows that we are part of international trade. It shows how important international trade is, and the two examples I've given, one that went against us with the importation of apples from New Zealand, one which went in our favour in relation to importation at that time of beef from North America are prime examples of the fact that the umpire must be allowed at the end of the day to regulate, to dictate, and if you want to play on the field, you yourself have got to be subject to the rules of the umpire. Now, what the bill would do is to actually skew those rules. It would impose on our importers a greater burden than indeed we would be imposing on our own producers, or that we would want imposed on ourselves as exporters. And unfortunately, you can't have it both ways. It's interesting, of course, that we need to ensure that a country's mandatory import requirements do not create unnecessary barriers to trade, taking account of the risks that non-compliance with those requirements would create. And I'll give you yet another example of how important it is that we retain and maintain the regulatory environment upon which we work now. I recall as a young veterinarian, acting Deputy President, the importation into the United States of our manufacturing beef was a growing market. Today, of course, vitally important. As we know, Australia exports manufacturing meat equivalent to what the McDonald's chain in the United States itself actually sells on a daily basis. But back in the early 1970s, when these rules were not as strong as they are, the United States beef lobby was strong enough to be able to influence the US Department of Agriculture to place upon Australia a set of requirements, in this case that we be free of the diseases tuberculosis and brucellosis, which indeed America was not, and to this day is still not, free of. And you might say, well, when it comes to brucellosis, where was the importance? I'm glad you asked that, Acting Deputy President, because brucellosis is actually a disease of the reproductive system and has got nothing to do with meat quality. And in the case of tuberculosis, what were the Americans doing requiring Australia to be free of TB when they themselves were not? That was a trade barrier. Now, because the industry was so important to us, in those early 1970s, Australia in fact did. We had the brucellosis and tuberculosis eradication scheme, only country in the world to have eradicated both of those diseases, of which our profession today and the Department of Agriculture of the time are justifiably proud. But it makes the point that there was a circumstance in which a barrier had been placed upon this country, Australia, simply for trade imposition purposes. When we actually got rid of brucellosis and tuberculosis, they had another go. They said, all right, your export abattoirs have got to be lifted to a very, very high standard, indeed a standard higher than those of the American abattoirs for their own domestic consumption. So we have moved on in the world. We've moved on, and we now have a circumstance, of course, in which both our sanitary and phytosanitary measures, some of which I've given examples of today, the SBS agreement and the technical barriers to trade agreement, are critically important pillars in the World Trade Organisation framework. And those, in my view, very, very strongly have to be protected and, in fact, have to be enhanced. So the difficulty that would confront us, Acting Deputy President, this bill would actually make our negotiations, those critical to Australia and to our export well-being and to the wealth of this economy. If passed, this bill would make those trade negotiations with other countries very, very much more difficult. It would have the effect of actually putting barriers in place, because any barrier that we impose on an importer, we can expect there will be an equivalent action against us as exporters. And as I've just pointed out, we actually export about 65% of everything that we produce. The bill, if passed, would require Australia to give less favourable treatment to goods imported from free trade agreement partners than treatment given to goods from other countries. In other words, we would once again be skewing the market. We would once again be removing what in fact is critical to international trade. We would be giving one group of importers an unfair advantage over others. They, in their turn, would logically and necessarily and quickly impose exactly the same sorts of restrictions on Australia. The bill, if passed, would require that Australia not consider applications for Australia to accept conformity assessment procedures in other countries as being equivalent to those in Australia. And I draw again on the analogies I have just given you with regard to BSE beef, where in fact that exact circumstance, conformity assessment procedures in other countries being equivalent to those in Australia. You will recall, because you were part of that committee process, that at that time we said we are not imposing on those other countries anything greater than we impose on our own producers. We have the National Livestock Identification System, and therefore we would expect any importing country to meet those same levels of requirement. The bill, if passed, would require that Australia not consider applications for Australia to accept that another country's requirements are equivalent to Australia's in terms of policy objectives being pursued. And I've got to say to you, there is an analogy here in the New Zealand apples. We argued that case. We actually believed that there were a different set of applications being imposed. It was, if you remember, the use of the antibiotic streptomycin, used at some stages in the production cycle of apples in New Zealand, not used here in Australia, and that was the argument that you and I and others presented at the time, but the umpire determined otherwise, and if we want to be part of international trade, as we do, we simply have got to say, well, on this particular case, the umpire's decision is final. I've got to say to you as an aside, I still regard the fact that we probably didn't do as good a job as we could have done in the appeals tribunal, but you probably in football circles, Acting Deputy President, would have appeared before the tribunal more often than I did, so maybe we should have sent you over to Geneva to argue it. But the other point that I need to make to you is the Madigan Bill, if passed, would require that Australia adopt import requirements that have the effect of creating unnecessary obstacles to trade. The example I give you again is the United States doing that to us in the 1970s with diseases like brucellosis, tuberculosis, etc. And we can't have that. We've moved on from that circumstance, and look at the advantage that it has been to our country. Look at the level now of export of agricultural produce in the case of manufacturing beef to the United States of America. And of course, we all know, Acting Deputy President, of the possibility of retaliatory action. One of the great strengths of the WTO process is its binding dispute settlement system. We just can't opt out if we don't like what the Chairman of Stewards told us. We take it on the chin, we correct it, and if we want to stay playing in the game, if we want to keep on the course, we must then obviously comply. We can't opt out, and it's tremendously to Australia's benefit that we remain opting in. It is the case that the dispute settlement rules do allow a complaining country, and we do plenty of that, to apply retaliatory action against a defending country's exports if the defending country has been found to be acting in breach of its rules and does not act to remedy those breaches. Now, we are in an exciting phase now. We have recently concluded the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement. We have just concluded, or in the final processes, hopefully of concluding, the Japan-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And as we know, we are in the circumstance where we witnessed the signing the other day by Trade Minister Rob and the Chinese equivalent of the Trade Minister from China signing the Australia-Chinese Free Trade Agreement. These are all incredibly exciting opportunities. I want to conclude, if I may, Acting Deputy President, by talking about Australia's role as a developed country in assisting least developed countries, underdeveloped countries and the small island development states. The best way that we can help those countries is to encourage their development of trade, to encourage their domestic consumption so that they will get to the stage where they themselves will be net exporters, and that we have got a set of rules and guidelines in place that will allow them to actually grow economically, to develop their people, to move them towards middle-class aspirations, all within a World Trade Organisation framework. That's where I stand.
Thank you, Senator Back.